Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Mortal Kombat from 1995. There's a new Mortal Kombat movie coming out soon. I thought I would look back at the original one, also because I really haven't seen it since the 90s. If you've probably heard me tell this story before on Pizza Party Podcast or something like that, basically what happened with me and the Mortal Kombat movie is I really wanted to see it. I played the game a lot in the 90s when I'd actually sort of play video games. It was a huge game. It was a huge property in the mid-90s. And when there was a movie coming out, I obviously wanted to see it. Unfortunately, my parents would not let me see it in 1995 as I was 12. And they said I was not allowed to see Mortal Kombat. Mostly they said because they didn't want to take me to see it, which doesn't hold a lot of water because I was seeing movies by myself, but I guess I wasn't 13, so they would have had to take me. I don't know how enforced PG-13 was, but they wouldn't let me see it, so I could not see it until it was on home video at a sleepover, in which I thought that it really sucked. Which I think is what I said pretty early on in the movie. I was like, this movie sucks. And I haven't seen it since then, and I didn't like it that time, even though I had made my mind up unfairly pretty quickly after. So I felt like, oh, it was fine that they wouldn't let me see it because that didn't work out. So I decided I would finally, after all these years, rewatch Mortal Kombat. This is very much kind of like a B studio movie, and not one that has like a huge budget. This one, even for the time, it had a ridiculously low budget of about 20 million, maybe 18 depending on your sources, but not a lot of money. It seemed like a priority for a studio like New Line, which in 1995 was still like the Freddy Krueger little smaller studio, and you could sort of have those at that time. It feels like that. It feels like that when you're watching it. It feels like a cheaper kind of B sort of thing. It's not an A picture kind of huge budgeted movie, which, I mean, sure, the property was big enough for that. I don't think at the time like studios were considering IP in that way, and they didn't give it to a big director like Paul Anderson, who's credited as Paul Anderson, who would become, even though he was at the time, but would eventually be credited as Paul W.S. Anderson due to the Resident Evil movies and everything. I realize I've never actually seen any of his movies, but this one, oddly. But he was kind of a no-name director, wasn't really a name property, a big auteur. They just sort of liked his first feature, which although is apparently the first lead from Jude Law, and we met his wife, Sadie Frost, and all that stuff, was not very notable at the time. And it seems like, I'm not sure like who turned this down, that's not known. And I do even think while watching it, like, they probably could have gotten a fairly good martial arts director to do this. But Paul Anderson does a decent enough job in this. I don't really begrudge him for any of his choices. He clearly wasn't, I haven't seen that other film, but he wasn't like a martial arts director. He wasn't someone who necessarily had fight choreography like in his bones like we see directors now. And certainly, yes, you know, you had Jet Li and Jackie Chan and a lot of people going on in the 90s that they clearly could have gone up to one of those directors who weren't in Hollywood and have them make an amazing Mortal Kombat movie, but that's not what we got. We get this kind of like very low rent kind of, it's basically a B movie, which I guess a Mortal Kombat movie should be, like a B version of Enter the Dragon, because all the fighting games like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, and pretty much all of them are versions of Enter the Dragon. Worse versions because duh. This plays like a supernatural kind of Enter the Dragon ripoff, and it's not necessarily like bad at it. The one criticism and why I kind of rejected it outright when I was a kid, and I still kind of don't like about it, is that Scorpion and Sub-Zero are basically just slaves of Shang Tsung and don't speak, except for Scorpion says get over here because he has to. I really didn't like that, and I actually was, when I was rewatching it, I was like, what was the scene that I just like decided this movie sucks? Because I remember it distinctly, like it was early on in the movie. I remember like a table flipping over or something like that. And I think I found the moment, and it was when Sub-Zero, and I think I basically was not cool with the movie. I was 12, so, you know, sorry, Mortal Kombat. But when Sub-Zero fights the guy, and he like basically flexes for way too long. Like, it is awkward. I don't understand what was going, still, like, it doesn't make any sense. He's just like overly flexing how muscular he is. And like, it's not cool. It just looks like they held the camera on him too long or something. And then Sub-Zero just like kills him, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, it doesn't say anything either. And that sequence isn't great. So I sort of get why I didn't really know B movies at the time. I didn't know martial martial arts movie. I don't think most people I've noticed when I'm watching reviews of this who were around my age, you know, a teenager or something like that at the time, mentioned how they hadn't seen any Bruce Lee or Enter the Dragon when they saw Mortal Kombat. So I was sort of an outlier. Not that it was a dumb opinion I had, so I'm not trying to act like I was smart by any means. But I was an outlier in that I didn't like it because most people did like it. But I think having context both makes me appreciate it and realize like everyone was just too extreme on this movie, to be honest, because within the guise of what it is, it's fine. It's like a fine, enjoyable kind of thing. It does the best job it really can. There's going to be a huge tournament to save Earth, and Earth has lost this tournament 9 out of 10 times, and if they lose 10 times, then they can like just take over the Earth, and I'm not sure what they're going to do with it, but it's not going to be good, presumably. And Johnny Cage, Sonya, and Liu Kang, guided by Raiden, and Jax is there also, and they're going to go win this tournament. If they win this tournament, they will save Earth and like release all these spirits and all this stuff. Basically, they have to win a tournament. They're people of different walks of life brought to this tournament to fight various people. Like, it's, if you've seen Enter the Dragon, it's like that. And the other thing with this film is they pick characters who I didn't really like or play by. Like sometimes Johnny Cage because he looked cool in sunglasses, but that was like about it. I'd mostly just want to play Scorpion, Sub-Zero. So I was against that. But watching this now, and it's funny why I didn't like this at the time, because I was so used to putting up with like comic book movies who you knew they had to do these things because that's how comic book movies were. Like I was used to a sci-fi book or a sci-fi movie being adapted in this weird sort of way, but for some reason I was not having it with this. But they picked basically like 3 characters: Sonya, Johnny Cage, and Liu Kang, and Raiden's just there. I don't get the whole Raiden thing and having Christopher Lambert as Raiden in this. I sort of like, I'm like, why don't you have Raiden do something cool? Would that have cost too much? Like, were you worried about actually ripping off Big Trouble in Little China this time? Because that's where the influence came from, if you didn't know that. It just felt like I was watching this like, why are you doing this in such a way? It's so weird. But they picked these 3 characters and they're the ones that they follow, and Johnny Cage very much felt like, oh, we have to have a white guy lead this movie because the 90s, I guess, were just really into white people. I don't know. That part never made sense because I was like, I remember being upset about that because like, would anyone pick Johnny Cage to run a Mortal Kombat movie? Like, wouldn't you want Scorpion? I was too focused on that, but I do think there's a certain amount of a point. But accepting that, like, he's fine. Some people really hate his humor. Maybe it's because I'm a dad now or something like that, but I found it like, it wasn't funny, but it was like, oh, this is a Hollywood movie, whatever. I did like that they call back to like his opening thing, and Sonya's fine as well. I sort of like her, but I do feel like the character of Liu Kang was really underserved. Like, he seemed to be the coolest one and the one with the coolest backstory and the one that was explained the best. Like, they opened the movie with like the thing with his brother, and like you totally get his arc the most. Everyone else is like, he's a fake action star. Is that like a thing? I've never heard of that in my life. Like, nobody said that about Jean-Claude Van Damme or Bruce Willis or any of those guys. Like, that, how that was that's such a kid movie headline thing. It was like, oh, people think he might be fake. I'm like, nobody cares. Like, is this a thing? Like, he clearly wasn't. We just saw him not be fake. Are they not editing it correctly? That would have been funny if he was like, look, I wanted to do it in one shot, but they drew all these cuts and stuff. That would have been funny. And Sonya's like going after Kano or something, and that's a whole thing that they don't explain very well, but I noticed the actress is so good at playing, and the movie's so good at playing it, you don't question it until she's like, oh, he killed her partner, and you're like, oh yeah, I guess that makes sense. Cool. But the Liu Kang thing, really, I feel like that should have been more of the through line, because he looked like he was more qualified at fighting. Everyone did a good fight sequence, to be honest with you, but I sort of like that plot line more, and I wish they had more of that. It was like, okay, I guess we'll do these other people too. And I didn't really get why you wouldn't do more Raiden and fights like that. And I know it's mainly the first game, which I played a lot more of than the second one, and then I think the third one came out right before this movie came out. And they didn't have like the most compelling, I would say, actors in it. I know Cameron Diaz was pretty much cast as Sonya, but she injured herself during training, and Bridget Wilson, who was originally cast and then left to do Billy Madison, and then literally left Billy Madison to do Mortal Kombat, to be enshrined in like every boys sleepover party for the next 10 years, basically, to be in both Mortal Kombat and Billy Madison. I definitely watched both of those at sleepovers in the 90s, so, you know, good for her. Wow, you did both those in a row. That was like my mid 90s right there. She was definitely like, if I just get the millennial young boy market, I'm down. And she definitely did that with those two. But her training wasn't, she couldn't train because all the pre-production she wasn't there for. Some people have complained about that. I actually liked her fight scene. It sort of worked in its own kind of crappiness, but I still find it compelling, oddly. So I'm fine with it. I don't mean that as an aside. I actually think, like, for apparently, like, everyone else had tons of training time and she had less training time. When you compare it, it's like, it's actually pretty amazing, to be honest with you. I think I was like, after this movie, I was like, man, what did she do? She should have been a bigger star. You know, it's kind of interesting to think what Cameron Diaz would have been like in this, but I think Bridget Wilson does a great job, as well as Robin Cho, who was Liu Kang. I was a little surprised, like, I think he's the only one who came back for the second one, which I've never seen. I thought he gave a good performance, and I'm okay with Lyndon Ashby. I will say the opening of this film really starts off like a boom. Like, it's immediately like the New Line logo comes up and the guy's screaming Mortal Kombat. I don't know why, but he is, in case you're like, we don't want anyone to come into this thinking this is a different movie. Immediately, we're going to hit you with this. And if you don't want to be here, we're going to prove it to you that you should leave immediately. Which, I like its directness. It is so direct at the beginning. You get Liu Kang's backstory right away. You get Sonya's backstory right away. You get Johnny Cage's backstory. It's like boom, 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 boom. And then you're in it. And I was like, whoa, this is cool. Like, I don't think the first 10 minutes of this movie moved in such a way, so much better than like the rest of the entire movie, but I was really impressed with that opening. I was like, this is really good, actually. Like, this, he like does a very good job of setting everybody up. I was very impressed by that. It was cool, like the movement, how quick the cutting was. It was like, that was an opening. I was surprised how much it got you in. The fights, the Scorpion Johnny Cage fight, I think is good. Like, that's probably the best fight sequence in the entire thing, with the trees and then going to that extra dimension. The Sub-Zero Liu Kang thing is okay. I feel like the way he gets rid of Sub-Zero is sort of lame. And then the end fight, I did like, because they have the spikes at the end and all that stuff. But ultimately, this is just a fun B kind of movie. PG-13 at the time, mostly because the target demographic were teenagers and younger kids, and if it was R, we couldn't have seen it. So as cool as that probably would have been, I think that was probably one of the things that like hurt this movie in a certain regard. But I also look at it as like, well, this is the best we're kind of gonna get in that era. When I look at it that way, it's actually a lot better. This film did very well. I keep seeing this weird statistic where it goes, oh, it made several times more than the other film that opened that weekend, which was Babysitter's Club. And I was like, that Babysitter's Club made like $3 million and Mortal Kombat made $23 million. Like, this clearly wasn't even close. I don't understand that comparison. But at the same time, like, it beat Dangerous Minds in its second week. And that's pretty amazing, because you think of how Gangsta's Paradise was such a huge song and all that. Also, this was the first EDM album to go platinum. They could have had a soundtrack that had like Van Halen and all the typical alternative rock at the time. And not that Van Halen's alternative, but like a lot of heavy metal sort of stuff. And they turned it down to do this. And this is, I knew a lot of kids who got into EDM through this soundtrack, which is actually pretty cool. Like, they like could have done like the big alternative soundtrack thing that, like, you know, Batman Forever and all those did, and they chose not to, and we're still talking about that Mortal Kombat song to this day. And I think it's because they went in a different direction. The EDM stuff, I think, brings up a lot of those action sequences in ways that people weren't doing at the time, and it kind of gave it more of an arcade feel, because they would play like arcade, that's like video game music is like EDM and so forth. So I think it was more natural. They were basically trying to do the game under the limitations that they had, and I think I've accepted that more now. But I think it's actually really good at doing that, to be honest with you. I think Paul Anderson understood the kind of, or Paul W.S. Anderson understood the kind of movie they were making at the time and went full into it. And you know, I don't think every fight sequence is amazing. I think the focus and the script was a little all over the place. There's sometimes characters jump to things and like change at the dime. Like when Sonya's just like kidnapped, it was like, because she's a girl, she's kidnapped. If you know B action stuff more, this movie is like actually really good under the guise of that. I think if you don't, which I didn't at the time, I can see just going like, this stinks. It's just kind of a fun B film, and I think like it did actually, for the kind of comic book movies, you compare this to the Super Mario Brothers movie and the Street Fighter movie and Double Dragon, which I've seen but don't remember, or most of anything, it is the topper tier in there, but it's one of those that like worked within the constraints that it had, but it worked out for it. The movie was really low budget. It couldn't be R-rated. It didn't have a real martial arts director, which, like, that was one of the things I kept thinking about. Like, they could have gotten someone. Like, who else did they try? I know actually Steven Spielberg, they were talking about getting him to do a cameo at the beginning during the Johnny Cage thing, and it didn't work out scheduling wise, but apparently it was a thing that was being discussed, and I sort of wish it had. I don't know if that's one of those Spielberg things that's not true or something like that, but I sort of wish it was. I remember Macaulay Culkin was a Mortal Kombat fan. He should have done a cameo. Or he should have just been Johnny Cage. This is just a fun, dumb B video game adaptation, but it's probably the one that's the best at it because it got what it was and just leaned into it. And it seemed like Paul W.S. Anderson at least had enough respect for the fight sequences. I've seen a lot of TV directors do a lot worse with bigger budgets, to be honest with you. Like, he did a good job, like, shooting this thing under the constraints. Like, there's certain sequences and fights that work really well. He cuts off some pretty early because it seems like they didn't have the budget or the time, but like that Johnny Cage Scorpion thing does live up to it. I like the Goro practical effects, actually. I know it was kind of at a time we were getting rid of them and doing more CG stuff, but it looks a lot better than the CG stuff in here, and that's kind of cool. I like that they tried to get all of the moves in the movie more naturally than even, I don't think Street Fighter did it as naturally as this. And so it seems like he got what this movie would be, the best thing he could make out of this, and I don't really begrudge him for that because it sort of works for itself, you know. When I was like constantly wanting to see movies that I wasn't allowed to, and I was like begging my parents to let me see Mortal Kombat, I think my mom made the comment that, you know, when you're older, you and a roommate will rent all these movies you weren't allowed to see and have a fun night out of it. I did do that last night, and it was fun revisiting this, to be honest with you. So I guess in the end, you know, this movie was better than I gave it credit for, and my mom was right. So in the end, Mortal Kombat isn't that bad. So if you have seen Mortal Kombat and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.